New York, 1788. The streets are narrow, crowded, and restless. A city not yet the bustling metropolis it would become, but already brimming with tension. The American Revolution has ended just a few years earlier, and the promise of a new nation lingers in the air. Yet beneath this thin veneer of optimism lies unease, rumors, whispers, and fears that will soon ignite into one of the strangest and darkest riots in early American history. A riot not over politics or taxation, but over something far more visceral, the dead themselves. Imagine walking through the city at night, the glow of tallow candles flickering behind shuttered windows, the cobblestone streets carrying the distant sound of carriage wheels. New York is still rough, still raw, and death is a constant presence. Graves are dug daily, funerals are simple affairs, and mourning is communal. For families, the grave represents sacred ground, the final resting place where the living can cling to the memory of the departed. But for a growing number of doctors and medical students in the city, the grave has become something else entirely, a hunting ground. At the heart of this dark story is a simple problem. Medicine cannot advance without knowledge of the human body, and the only way to gain that knowledge is through dissection. In Europe, the practice of anatomical study had already fueled fierce debate, with resurrection men digging up the freshly buried to sell to medical schools. In New York, the same thing begins to happen. Rumors spread that bodies are being stolen from shallow graves, especially in the potter's fields where the poor and enslaved are laid to rest. And when bodies go missing, grief twists into anger. The people of New York live in a world where the soul is believed to linger close to the body. Desecration of a corpse isn't just an insult, it's a theft of dignity, an act that could condemn the spirit to unrest. Against this backdrop, doctors are seen not as healers, but as men playing with forces beyond morality, desecrating what should be untouchable. The image of physicians cutting into stolen corpses by candlelight becomes a nightmare whispered from door to door. What makes this story even more chilling is that it begins with something almost mundane. A child playing near the New York hospital, peeking through a window, sees what he believes to be an arm dangling from a table inside the dissection room. The story is passed from one mouth to another, and in a city where rumors move faster than facts, it doesn't take long before outrage builds into fury. Crowds form, first out of curiosity, then out of suspicion, and finally out of rage. When the doors are broken open, the grisly sight inside confirms their worst fears: bodies dissected, limbs piled, medical students working with the dead as if they were nothing more than objects. The city erupts. But before we plunge into the riot itself, it's important to understand what brought New York to this breaking point. Life in the 18th century was fragile. Epidemics like smallpox and yellow fever claimed lives by the thousands. Doctors, though few in number, were both desperately needed and deeply distrusted. Their knowledge was limited, their methods often brutal. Bleeding, blistering, and purging were common treatments. Families often saw little improvement in their loved ones, and many wondered if physicians were experimenting more than healing. This skepticism made it easy for the public to believe that doctors might stoop to robbing graves. After all, if they could cut open a corpse, what moral line would they not cross? The tension was not just about science versus superstition. It was also about class. The wealthy had vaults, guarded cemeteries, and elaborate burials that protected their dead. But the poor, immigrants, and African Americans were buried in simple wooden boxes, often in poorly guarded fields. It was their graves that were most often violated, their loved ones most often stolen. And so when the riot began, it was fueled not only by outrage at the desecration of the dead, but by years of resentment at the inequality of life and death in the city. This is the world we are stepping into, a New York City where the dead are not safe, where the line between progress and desecration is blurred, and where ordinary citizens are about to take justice into their own hands. The doctors' riot of 1788 will leave bodies in the street, buildings under siege, and a city forced to reckon with the cost of medical knowledge. It is a story of science and superstition, of the living and the dead, and of a violent confrontation that revealed the darkest fears of a young America. And as we peel back the layers of this unsettling event, one question remains: what price should humanity pay for progress, and who, in the end, is forced to pay it? In 1788, New York was a city in transition. Still recovering from the scars of war, it was both a place of ambition and of unease. The revolution had ended only a few years earlier, and the city, having served as a battleground, an occupied capital under the British, and then a reclaimed hub of the new nation, was struggling to define itself. The streets were crowded with carts, livestock, and workers. The harbour thrummed with ships carrying goods and immigrants, and the air itself seemed heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and decay. Beneath the lively exterior, however, the city carried a hidden fragility. Death was never far away, and fear was never hard to find. New York in the late 18th century was small by modern standards, with a population just edging toward 30,000. But for those who lived there, it felt immense, chaotic, and alive. People from every background mingled in its streets: merchants from Europe, enslaved Africans, free black families, poor Irish and German laborious, and wealthy landowners who strutted with a sense of entitlement. Class divisions were stark, visible in every neighborhood, every home, and every burial ground. The city was trying to modernize, but it remained tethered to old-world fears and traditions. Disease haunted this landscape like a shadow. Yellow fever, smallpox, cholera, each outbreak could wipe out hundreds, sometimes thousands, in a matter of weeks. Physicians were few, often poorly trained, and their methods crude. A doctor might arrive at a patient's bedside carrying not cures but knives, leeches, and cups for bleeding. Many believed more people died under medical care than survived it. And yet, doctors represented hope, the thin line between survival and certain death. Families placed their trust in men who often had little more than apprenticeships or brief study in Europe to claim authority. But if medicine was primitive, the thirst for advancement was not. Enlightenment ideas had reached America, and with them came the belief that science could illuminate the mysteries of the human body. Medical students in New York looked enviously to their counterparts in Edinburgh and London, who dissected corpses in anatomy theaters, mapping the human frame with precision. To compete, to elevate American medicine, New York's doctors needed the same opportunities. But there was a problem: bodies. The law permitted very few legal dissections. Executed criminals' corpses were sometimes granted to medical schools, but executions were rare. For every one cadaver provided by the courts, dozens of students clamored for the chance to study. In desperation, the search for bodies turned toward the city cemeteries. Graves were shallow, coffins hastily built, and guards scarce. In poorer districts and the potter's fields, burial was little more than covering a wooden box with a thin layer of soil. It didn't take much effort for someone with strong arms and a shovel to retrieve a fresh corpse under the cover of night. The practice of resurrectionists, as they were known, had already developed in Europe, where professional body snatchers sold corpses to medical colleges. In New York, the work was done more informally, by students themselves or by paid assistants working directly for doctors. It was a dangerous business, not because of the law, but because of the public. Few crimes could stir outrage like grave robbing, and the punishment was often not a courtroom trial but mob justice. The cultural context made the crime even more terrifying. For the citizens of New York, the grave was sacred. Religious belief taught that the body and soul remained bound even in death. Desecrating a body was not just vandalism, it was an assault on the dead person's eternal rest. Families clung to the belief that their loved ones must remain whole in the grave for resurrection at the end of days. To imagine their bodies hacked apart on a dissection table was almost unbearable. This tension was heightened by inequality. The wealthy buried their dead in secure cemeteries, behind walls, with headstones and iron fences. Guards could be hired if necessary, but the poor and marginalized had no such protection. Enslaved Africans, free black families, and impoverished immigrants buried their dead in unguarded plots, often outside the city's main grounds. It was their graves that were most vulnerable. And as whispers spread that doctors were targeting these sites, anger swelled, not only at the theft of bodies but at the injustice of who was chosen for desecration. It was not only about the dead. It was about dignity, class, and power. To lose a loved one was already devastating. To have that loved one stolen and dissected by students, as if their life had been worth nothing, was an insult too deep to ignore. Families began to keep vigil at gravesides, taking turns guarding freshly dug earth through the night. Some cemeteries organized watchmen. Others armed themselves. Still, bodies continued to disappear. And with each disappearance, resentment built like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, within the halls of the New York hospital, young men in aprons leaned over corpses by candlelight, learning the intricacies of muscles, veins, and organs. To them, this was not sacrilege but progress, the price that had to be paid for medicine to advance. In their eyes, the dead were no longer individuals but specimens. Yet the more knowledge they gained, the more they alienated themselves from the public they served. This clash of perspectives created a powder keg. Doctors and students believed they were serving the future of science. Ordinary citizens believed their dead were being stolen and desecrated. In a city already tense with class conflict, disease, and inequality, it would take only the smallest spark to ignite rage. That spark was coming. And when it arrived, it would turn New York into a battlefield, not over taxes or kings, but over the sanctity of the grave. The stage was set, the city restless, the rumors unrelenting. The people were ready to rise. And when they did, the fury unleashed would become one of the bloodiest riots in the early history of the United States. The story of the doctors' riot cannot be understood without looking closely at the people at its center: the medical schools, the students who dissected in dimly lit rooms, and the families whose dead were stolen from the earth. This was not a faceless clash between citizens and doctors. It was far more personal, more intimate. It was about specific neighborhoods, real families, and ambitious young men whose hunger for knowledge collided with society's deepest fears. New York in 1788 did not yet have fully established medical colleges like those in Europe. Instead, aspiring physicians learned their trade through apprenticeships and through the city's growing hospital system. The New York Hospital, located on Broadway near present-day Pearl Street, became the focal point of medical training. It was here that young apprentices gathered, eager to cut into flesh and bone, eager to prove themselves to their mentors, eager to transform the abstract theories they read in books into practical knowledge. For these students, anatomy was more than study. It was revelation. To peel back the layers of muscle, to trace the paths of arteries, to see with their own eyes what no diagram could fully capture. This was to step into the hidden architecture of human life. Many of them came from privileged backgrounds, sons of families who could afford to place them in apprenticeship under respected physicians. They viewed themselves as pioneers of science, part of a noble pursuit to modernize medicine in the New World. But while their ambitions were lofty, the means by which they pursued them were anything but noble. Legal cadavers were in short supply. Executed criminals' bodies were sometimes given to medical schools, but executions were not common enough to satisfy demand. A handful of bodies each year could not serve dozens of students. The only alternative was theft. And so, many of these young men turned to the graveyards. Students, often under cover of night, slipped into the potter's fields with shovels in hand. Sometimes they were joined by hired assistants, laborious paid in coins to dig quickly and silently. Graves were shallow, only a few feet deep. A team could remove a body in less than half an hour. The poor, the enslaved, and immigrants were the most frequent victims, their graves chosen precisely because they lacked the protection of wealth. Coffins were simple, burial sites unguarded, and mourners often lacked the means to patrol through the night. Once stolen, the bodies were carried back to the hospital and hidden in cellars or anatomy rooms. There, by flickering candlelight, students would set to work. The smell of decay mixed with the tang of smoke and alcohol, as they preserved what they could with crude methods. They cut, examined, and discarded what remained when their lessons were done. To them, it was science. To the families of the stolen, it was sacrilege. Among the communities most deeply affected were the city's free black families and enslaved people. For them, burial was one of the few dignities permitted in life. The African burial ground, just north of the city limits, became the resting place for thousands. It was a sacred site, hallowed ground. But to the students and doctors, it was also convenient, close, accessible, unguarded. The violation of these graves struck not only at the sanctity of death but at the very humanity of a people already denied equality in life. Their grief, their outrage, was all the more profound because it confirmed what they already knew. Their bodies, even in death, were treated as less than sacred. The whispers spread. Families who buried their dead returned days later to find the soil disturbed, coffins broken, and bodies missing. Anger simmered in taverns, in churches, in the narrow alleys of the city. The stories carried weight because they aligned with something everyone already suspected: the doctors were taking bodies. Whether all the rumors were true or not did not matter. The perception was enough to convince the city that its healers were grave robbers in disguise. Inside the hospital, meanwhile, the culture among students was one of secrecy mixed with arrogance. Some bragged of their midnight expeditions. Others joked crudely about the bodies they dissected. To them, it was all part of their education, a rite of passage. Yet even among themselves, there must have been moments of unease. They knew the public hated them for it. They knew that if caught, they could face not only legal punishment but the fury of an angry mob. Still, the hunger for knowledge outweighed the fear of reprisal. The senior doctors, men like Richard Bailey, a respected physician and anatomy teacher, encouraged the practice, if not directly then by turning a blind eye. They needed cadavers to teach, and if their students supplied them through questionable means, so be it. Progress demanded sacrifice. What they failed to consider was that the sacrifice was not theirs to make. The city itself became divided. On one side, a small circle of doctors and students working in secret, convinced of their higher calling. On the other, thousands of ordinary citizens, convinced that their dead were being stolen and desecrated. The tension grew heavier with each whispered story, with each disturbed grave. And in a society where trust between citizens and institutions was already fragile, the hospital became a symbol of elitism and betrayal. At the human core of this brewing storm were families. Mothers who visited the graves of their children only to find them empty. Fathers who felt powerless to protect the bodies of their wives. Communities who watched vigilantly at night, knowing their grief could be interrupted by thieves in the dark. Their stories gave flesh and blood to the rumors. They turned abstract outrage into personal rage. The line was clear, though neither side admitted it. To the doctors, the dead were specimens. To the families, they were loved ones. That single irreconcilable difference, the inability to agree on what a corpse represented, was the crack that would split the city open. And when the moment came, when a curious boy peered through a hospital window and saw what looked like a severed limb dangling in the dissection room, that fragile balance shattered. The boy's scream, the crowd's rush, the sudden invasion of the hospital, all of it was the inevitable eruption of years of suspicion and simmering fury. Before the riot exploded into violence, before blood ran in the streets, New York was already divided into two camps. On one side, young men of science, armed with scalpels, chasing knowledge in the shadows. On the other, families of the poor, the marginalized, and the powerless, guarding their dead against those who claimed to heal the living. The stage was set, the actors already in place. All that remained was for fear to ignite into fury. The city's breaking point came not with an official decree or a public discovery, but with whispers that spread like smoke through crowded streets and taverns. Rumors are oxygen in a city like New York, dense, combustible, and always waiting for a spark. For months, families had complained of disturbed graves, of coffins left splintered, of earth turned over where it should have been untouched. Some dismissed it as paranoia, others as tragic accidents. But most people suspected what they had always feared. Doctors were stealing the dead. And in a city that clung fiercely to the sanctity of the grave, this was an outrage that no one could ignore for long. These whispers were not vague accusations. They carried vivid details, spoken with the certainty of people who claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. A mother who buried her child returned to find the coffin lid split and empty. A group of men swore they caught students moving a sack that clearly contained human remains. Workers claimed to have seen young doctors slipping into graveyards at night with lanterns and shovels. Whether all of these accounts were true or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that they fit the people's fears too perfectly. And fear, once given a story, hardens quickly into truth. In this atmosphere of suspicion, the divide between citizens and doctors grew wider. To ordinary New Yorkers, the medical profession seemed cloaked in secrecy, its practitioners unaccountable and indifferent to the suffering of the families they violated. Doctors were seen as elites, aloof, arrogant, untouched by the rules that governed ordinary life. Their hospitals were not houses of healing but chambers of horror, where human dignity was sacrificed for cold experiments. For citizens already living on the edge of survival, this was intolerable. It was in this climate that the spark finally came. The story, passed from mouth to mouth, begins with a boy. He was playing near the New York hospital, where students were known to practice their anatomy lessons. Drawn by curiosity, he pressed his face against a window and peered inside. What he saw, or thought he saw, froze his blood. On a table, lit by the flicker of candlelight, lay a body, dissected and open. And in one grisly detail, which would echo through the city, the boy noticed a severed arm hanging limply from a student's hands. Some accounts claim that the boy recognized the arm as belonging to his recently deceased mother. Others say the student, noticing the boy, taunted him by waving the limb and mocking his grief. The truth of that moment may never be fully known. But what matters is that the boy ran screaming into the street, convinced that the doctors had taken his mother from the grave. The story spread with lightning speed. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the hospital, first out of curiosity, then out of outrage. Mothers clutched their children, fathers shouted for vengeance, and neighbors whispered about which graves had been disturbed most recently. The rumor of the boy's discovery became fact in the public's mind, and the hospital became the target of their fury. Inside, the students and doctors scrambled. They had long feared this moment, when suspicion would turn into direct confrontation. Anatomy rooms were cleared, specimens hidden, doors barred. But it was too late. The crowd demanded answers, and the only answers they wanted were justice and revenge. The press played its role as well. Newspapers, often sensational and politically charged, fed the fire with lurid headlines about body snatching. The public had little reason to doubt it. After all, even without the boy's tale, too many graves had been disturbed, too many whispers had gone unanswered. Trust was already broken, and once broken, it could not be repaired. The fears that drove the crowd were not just about science and superstition. They were about power, class, and dignity. The poor had no protection for their dead. They knew the wealthy were safe, their loved ones buried in guarded cemeteries with stone monuments and iron gates. But the poor, the enslaved, and the marginalized had only shallow graves and thin coffins. It was their dead who were stolen, their families who were mocked by the silence of the medical profession. In this sense, the riot was not only about anatomy. It was about injustice. The tension escalated with each passing hour. What began as suspicion transformed into anger, and anger soon sharpened into fury. Men armed themselves with clubs, stones, and knives. Women shouted for the doctors to be dragged from the hospital. The smell of smoke from taverns and homes mixed with the electric charge of rage in the air. The city was on the edge of violence, and everyone knew it. The militia, called to calm the crowd, found themselves surrounded by hundreds of angry citizens. Their presence only added to the tension. Was the government protecting the people, or shielding the doctors? In a society where institutions were already distrusted, the sight of armed men defending the hospital only deepened the fury. For the students, the atmosphere inside the hospital must have been suffocating. They were young men, some barely more than boys themselves, who had chosen medicine out of ambition and curiosity. Now, they were trapped in a building that the crowd saw as a charnel house, a place of desecration. Their scalpels and bones, once tools of study, were now evidence of crimes too monstrous to forgive. The stage was set. The rumors had done their work. The boy's story had struck the final blow to public patience. And the crowd outside the New York hospital was no longer content with whispers or suspicion. They wanted proof, they wanted retribution, and they were ready to tear the building apart to get it. When the doors finally gave way and the crowd surged inside, they found what they expected, and worse. Anatomy tables with half-dissected corpses. Piles of limbs. Jars of organs preserved in spirits. The sight confirmed every nightmare rumor, every whispered fear, every suspicion that the doctors were grave robbers and body snatchers. What the crowd saw that night was enough to transform suspicion into rage and fear into violence. The riot had begun. The mob crashed through the doors of the New York hospital like a storm breaking against a cliffside. The sound of splintering would echo down the halls, followed by the roar of voices that carried the anger of a city. Torches lit the darkness, throwing wild shadows across walls and staircases as hundreds of men surged forward, their boots pounding against the floor. What they found inside turned their fury into something far more dangerous: vindication. The rooms of the hospital, meant to be places of study, had become chambers of horror in the eyes of the crowd. On the dissecting tables lay the unmistakable forms of human corpses, cut open, half dissected, and surrounded by tools of the trade, scalpels, saws, and hooks, glinting in the firelight. Some bodies were so fresh that faces could still be recognized, features still visible. Others were reduced to little more than bones and scraps of flesh. Limbs lay piled in corners, torsos half dissected, and jars filled with organs floated in cloudy alcohol. It was not science that the mob saw. It was desecration. The reaction was immediate and violent. Shouts of rage filled the rooms. Men lifted the dissected remains and hurled them into the street, casting the bodies before the eyes of the waiting crowd outside. Women screamed. Children cried. And the mob grew more furious with each grisly discovery. What had once been whispers and suspicion was now undeniable. Here was the evidence, laid out in grotesque detail. The doctors had indeed been stealing the dead. Students and apprentices, caught in the onslaught, tried desperately to flee. Some bolted down staircases, slipping on blood-stained floors. Others barricaded themselves in side rooms, pressing their bodies against doors as fists and axes pounded on the other side. A few disguised themselves, attempting to slip out with the crowd, but many were recognized and dragged back. They were pelted with stones, beaten with fists, threatened with death. The mob demanded names, demanded confessions, demanded blood. Senior physicians fared little better. Richard Bailey, one of the city's most prominent doctors, barely escaped with his life. Accounts say he fled through the chaos, slipping away before the mob could seize him. Others were not so fortunate. Students were pulled from hiding places and paraded through the streets, jeered at and struck as they were forced toward jails or militia custody. The very men who saw themselves as pioneers of medicine now found themselves hunted like criminals. The militia, called in to restore order, marched into the fray with muskets and bayonets, their uniforms catching the torchlight. But their presence was not met with gratitude, it was met with suspicion. To the mob, the soldiers were not protectors but accomplices, defending the doctors rather than the dignity of the dead. Stones and bottles flew at the militia. Shouts of traitors, and protect the graves, rang out. The line between restoring peace and fueling violence blurred quickly. Clashes broke out in the streets surrounding the hospital. Musket barrels gleamed as militiamen leveled their weapons at the crowd. The mob, armed with whatever they could find, axes, knives, clubs, even bones taken from the dissecting rooms, charged back. The first gunshots rang out, echoing across Broadway. Panic tore through the throng as men fell to the ground, blood pooling on the cobblestones. Some accounts suggest as many as 20 people were killed that day, though the exact number remains uncertain. What is certain is that the violence was real, bloody, and unforgettable. The hospital itself was nearly torn apart. Windows shattered, furniture smashed, doors ripped from their hinges. Anatomy texts and surgical tools were hurled into the street, trampled by furious fate. The mob roared its triumph not in words but in destruction, stripping the hospital of its authority and dignity. To them, this was justice, an answer to years of rumors, an answer to the theft of their dead. The riot did not remain contained to one building. Word spread rapidly through the city, carried on the shouts of those who had witnessed the horrors inside. Crowds swelled in other neighborhoods, and soon, the fury spread beyond the hospital itself. Doctors' homes became targets. Medical students were hunted down in the streets. Even those with only distant ties to the hospital feared for their lives. The city was alive with the sound of pursuit and vengeance. One chilling detail recurs in eyewitness accounts: the sight of dismembered limbs and organs strewn across the streets, hurled from hospital windows by rioters who wanted the whole city to see what the doctors had done. It was a grotesque theater, a performance of rage and horror designed to strip medicine of its secrecy. No longer hidden behind closed doors, the work of the students was laid bare for all to witness. The visual evidence, the severed flesh of stolen dead, became both proof and rallying cry. The riot lasted hours, stretching into days of unrest. Each attempt by the militia to restore order only stoked further violence. Arrests were made, but the jails overflowed, and many citizens sympathized with the rioters rather than the authorities. The governor himself was forced to intervene, sending in more troops to suppress the chaos. Yet even as soldiers marched through the streets, the air still trembled with fury. The fear of desecration still clung to the people. For the doctors, the riot was a nightmare come to life. Some fled the city altogether, fearing retribution. Others retreated into secrecy, conducting their studies behind locked doors and under heavier guard. The hospital's reputation was stained, perhaps permanently. Trust between the medical profession and the public, already fragile, was shattered. Patients began to avoid physicians, fearful not only of their treatments but of what they might do to their bodies after death. The riot was more than an eruption of violence. It was a reckoning. It revealed the depth of mistrust between the common people and the medical elite. It exposed the class divisions that marked life and death in the city. And it showed that science, however noble its aims, could not advance without confronting the human cost of its methods. In the aftermath of that first explosion of violence, the city would be forced to reckon with questions it had long ignored. Who owns the dead? Who decides what is sacred, and what is expendable in the pursuit of knowledge? And how much anger can a society bear before it erupts into fury? That night, New York learned that desecrating the graves of the powerless would not go unanswered. And the price of progress was written not in textbooks or medical discoveries, but in blood on the streets. The riot did not end with the storming of the hospital. It spread outward, like fire jumping from rooftop to rooftop, consuming the city in chaos. By the following day, New York was not merely restless, it was a city under siege by its own citizens. The discovery of bodies inside the hospital had confirmed every suspicion, and now the rage of the mob sought new targets. What began as an assault on a single building became a campaign against an entire profession. The militia, overwhelmed by the first wave of violence, tried desperately to reassert control. Lines of soldiers marched through the streets with muskets raised, bayonets fixed, their faces set in grim determination. But they were outnumbered. The crowd had swelled into the thousands, men and women pouring in from neighborhoods across the city, their anger fueled not just by rumor but by the gruesome spectacle they had witnessed: severed limbs, dissected bodies, organs scattered across hospital floors. These images clung to them like nightmares, and the militia's uniforms were no shield against that kind of fury. Streets became battlegrounds. On Broadway, militia formations clashed with mobs wielding clubs, stones, and knives. Gunfire cracked across the cobblestones, the sound echoing against wooden storefronts and church steeples. Each musket shot sent crowds scattering, only for them to regroup moments later, surging forward again with renewed rage. Blood pooled in the gutters. Injured men staggered into doorways, clutching wounds, leaving streaks of red along the walls. The dead were left where they fell, trampled underfoot as the mob pressed on. Doctors' homes were next. The rioters knew who the physicians were, where they lived, and they did not hesitate to bring the fight to their doorsteps. Stone-shattered windows, doors were broken open, and furniture was dragged into the streets and burned. Any hint of medical study, a book, a skeleton, a surgical kit, was treated as evidence of guilt, seized and destroyed. Families of doctors fled into the night, leaving behind possessions to be looted or burned. For those tied to the hospital, no place in the city felt safe. The fury was not random. It carried with it the deep weight of class resentment. The poor had always known their graves were vulnerable, their dead more likely to be stolen. Now, with proof before their eyes, they struck not only against the doctors but against the entire system that allowed such violations to occur. The wealthy, whose cemeteries were secure and guarded, watched uneasily from a distance as the riot unfolded. For once, it was not their families who bore the brunt of the mob's rage. It was the city's elites of medicine, men who often walked with the wealthy, who now found themselves cast down into the role of villains. At the African burial ground, where thousands of enslaved and free black New Yorkers had been laid to rest, the outrage was palpable. Families gathered at gravesides, watching over the earth, some armed with makeshift weapons, determined that no more bodies would be taken. For them, the riot was not merely justice, it was vengeance. Generations of indignity in life had been compounded by desecration in death, and the fury that now boiled over was the voice of those who had too often been silenced. The violence reached its peak when the militia, reinforced with additional troops, opened fire into the crowds. Muskets flared, smoke filled the air, and the screams of the wounded cut through the chaos. Estimates vary, but dozens may have been killed in the clash. Eyewitnesses describe bodies lying in heaps on the cobblestones, blood soaking into the dirt, the stench of powder and iron hanging over the city. The soldiers, grim and tense, fought not only to protect doctors but to protect themselves from being overwhelmed. The mob, unwilling to retreat, surged again and again into the line of fire. By nightfall, New York resembled a city at war. Fires burned in scattered corners, their glow casting long shadows across wooden buildings. The tolling of church bells, once a call to prayer, now echoed as an alarm, warning of fresh outbreaks of violence. Crowds roamed the streets with torches, chanting for justice, chanting for vengeance. The militia patrolled in tight formations, weapons always at the ready, knowing that a single spark could set off another explosion of rage. Inside their homes, families huddled in fear. Some sympathized with the rioters, whispering prayers for justice. Others feared that the violence would not stop at the doctors but would consume anyone perceived as wealthy or connected. New York, already fragile after years of war, felt as if it might collapse into something darker, something uncontrollable. Doctors who had once commanded respect now became fugitives. Some disguised themselves and fled the city, seeking refuge in nearby towns. Others hid in cellars or lofts, praying that the mob would pass them by. Apprentices, many still in their teens, faced the wrath of men twice their size. They had thought themselves scholars, but in the eyes of the mob, they were grave robbers, desecrators, villains. For many of them, the riot was not just terrifying, it was the shattering of their identity. And yet, beneath the violence, there was something more, a message, clear and brutal. The people of New York had drawn a line, and they had done so with blood. The dead, they declared, were not property. They were not specimens. They were sacred, and anyone who violated that sanctity would face the full weight of the community's fury. When dawn broke, The city bore scars it would not soon forget. Streets were littered with broken glass, smashed doors, and pools of blood that had dried to a dark crust on the cobblestones. The hospital was gutted, its reputation in ruins. Families counted their dead and tended to the wounded. Doctors and students, scattered and shaken, contemplated the price they had paid for their pursuit of knowledge. The riot had started as anger over graves, but it had become something much larger. It was about class. It was about power. It was about the fragile trust between those who claimed authority and those who lived under it. And in that moment, New York became a mirror of the wider tensions in America itself. Tensions between elites and common people, between science and faith, between progress and dignity. The city would eventually calm, but the memory of those bloody streets would linger for generations. And long after the bodies were buried once more, the question remained: was the knowledge gained in dissecting the dead worth the lives lost in the living? The riot may have been sparked by doctors and students, but its deepest roots lay in the experiences of those who suffered most, the families whose dead were stolen. To understand the fury that swept New York, one must understand who these victims were. They were not the wealthy, who buried their loved ones behind stone walls and hired guards to keep vigil. They were the poor, the immigrants, the enslaved, and the free black families who lived on the margins of society. They were the people who had the least protection in life, and, as it turned out, even less in death. For the city's elites, burial meant permanence. Their cemeteries were enclosed, often attached to churches that stood at the heart of New York's most prominent neighborhoods. Elaborate tombstones, iron gates, and sometimes even hired watchmen ensured that the bodies of the rich would remain undisturbed. But for the majority of New Yorkers, especially the working poor, burial was a simpler affair. Coffins were roughly made, graves shallow, and markers nothing more than wooden stakes. In the potter's fields, where the city interred its poorest citizens, bodies were sometimes buried only inches beneath the soil, stacked in crowded rows with little separation. It was from these places that doctors and students drew their supply. The poor man's grave was an open invitation, a body waiting to be claimed. Families often knew this, which is why some kept vigils at night, sitting by their loved one's resting place with lanterns and weapons, daring anyone to approach. But no family could guard a grave forever. Once the mourners left, the soil was vulnerable. By the next morning, a coffin could be gone, the earth freshly turned, the body carried away to the hospital dissecting room. Among the most heavily targeted were New York's black community. Both enslaved and free, black families had long endured the indignities of poverty and discrimination. In life, they were forced to the margins. In death, they were consigned to the African burial ground, a stretch of land outside the city limits where thousands were interred. For these families, the burial ground was sacred, a final refuge in a world that offered them little dignity. Yet it was this very ground that doctors plundered most freely. It was close to the city, unguarded, and its graves belonged to people the authorities were least likely to defend. For black New Yorkers, the desecration of their dead was more than theft. It was confirmation of a cruel truth, that even in death, they were considered less than human. Their bodies, in the eyes of the students, were not loved ones but specimens, anonymous, disposable, tools for cutting and study. The riot gave voice to this outrage. When the crowd stormed the hospital, they were not just avenging disturbed graves in general. They were avenging specific indignities borne disproportionately by the city's most vulnerable people. Immigrants, too, bore the brunt of the theft. Irish and German families, many of whom lived in squalid conditions on the edges of the city, buried their dead quickly and with few resources. They knew their graves were vulnerable, but poverty gave them no alternatives. Stories spread of mothers digging into the earth with their bare hands, weeping when they found the coffin of a child empty. For these families, the desecration was not an abstract violation of sacred belief. It was a personal wound, a second loss layered on top of grief. The riot revealed the deep injustice at the heart of the practice. The bodies stolen were not random. They were chosen because their families had little power to resist. The students did not dig into the guarded cemeteries of the elite. They did not risk their reputations by plundering the tombs of the wealthy. They targeted those whose lives were already cheapened by society. The dead became a mirror of the living hierarchy. The powerful were protected, the powerless exploited. This explains why the riot was so ferocious, why the anger burned so hot. It was not simply about the sanctity of the grave. It was about dignity, equality, and survival. To the rioters, the theft of their dead was proof of what they already felt in life, that they were less than citizens, less than human in the eyes of those in power. The rage that tore through the hospital walls was centuries of indignity given form, centuries of silence suddenly screaming in the streets. And yet, the victims were not only the poor or marginalized. They were also the families who lived with suspicion and fear, never knowing if the grave they dug today would still be intact tomorrow. In a city where disease could strike at any time, death was already a constant presence. To add the threat of desecration was almost unbearable. Parents buried children with the knowledge that the final act of love, laying them to rest, might be stolen from them. Wives buried husbands knowing they might be dragged from the earth to lie on a dissecting table. Every death carried with it not only grief but dread. The riot was, in many ways, their only weapon. The poor had no courts to defend them, no political power to demand change. What they had was their numbers, their anger, and their willingness to rise as a crowd. In that sense, the violence was both tragedy and necessity. It was the only way to force the city to recognize the humanity of those whose graves had been treated as nothing more than supply. When we remember the doctors' riot, it is easy to focus on the students, the militia, the chaos in the streets. But at its core, the story belongs to the victims, the families whose grief was mocked, whose dead were stolen, whose dignity was denied. They are the reason the riot burned so fiercely, the reason blood was spilled in the streets of New York. Without their suffering, there would have been no outrage, no uprising, no reckoning. The victims of the doctors' riot remind us of a grim truth. Progress is often built on the backs of those who cannot defend themselves. The knowledge gained in the dissecting rooms of New York Hospital came at the cost of the city's most vulnerable, whose only crime was poverty, or color, or powerlessness. And in 1788, those voices, long ignored, finally made themselves heard, not in petitions or speeches, but in the thunder of a mob that refused to be silent any longer. For the doctors and students at the heart of the storm, the riot was not merely an outbreak of public anger, it was the collapse of a fragile bargain they had convinced themselves was sustainable. They knew the risks of their actions, knew the public despised them for their methods, yet they pressed on, convinced that what they were doing was essential for progress. To them, the grave was not sacred soil but a library of knowledge waiting to be opened. Where ordinary citizens saw desecration, they saw the raw material of discovery. And in their eyes, the advancement of medicine justified every trespass. The physicians of late 18th century New York were not the doctors we imagine today. They did not wear white coats or wield stethoscopes. They were men trained in a patchwork of traditions, part scholar, part craftsman, often part gambler. Many had studied in Europe, in the anatomy theatres of London or Edinburgh, where corpses were routinely stolen and sold to medical schools. Some had seen firsthand the famous dissection rooms, where paying crowds watched students peel away layers of muscle and bone like actors performing on stage. To these men, the practice of dissection was not only necessary, it was expected. If New York was to become a center of medicine, if American physicians were to rival their European peers, they would need bodies. And if the law did not provide them, then they would take them. For medical students, most of them young men barely in their 20s, dissection was the pinnacle of their training. Books could describe the human body, but only the knife could reveal its secrets. To cut into flesh was to cross a threshold, to enter a realm forbidden to most but necessary for those who would heal. The first cut was a shock, the resistance of skin, the texture of fat, the smell of decay, but once crossed, the boundary blurred. Soon the human body became, in their eyes, an object. Nerves, veins, muscles, these were not parts of a person but structures to be studied, catalogued, mastered. The more they worked, the less they saw the dead as individuals, the more they saw them as tools. There was a certain arrogance in this transformation. Students joked among themselves about the corpses they worked on, mocking the very people whose graves they had robbed. They referred to the dead with nicknames, spoke of them as curiosities rather than human beings. To an outsider, these jokes would have sounded cruel, heartless. But for the students, they were a shield against the horror of what they were doing. Humor dulled the edge of sacrilege, turned the unbearable into routine. In time, the boundary between respect and desecration disappeared entirely. Senior physicians encouraged this culture, if not openly, then by quiet approval. Richard Bailey, one of the city's leading medical instructors, was known to push his students hard in anatomical study. Bailey believed that without dissection, true medicine was impossible. He was not wrong. Anatomical knowledge would one day save countless lives. But in the context of 1788, when bodies could only be obtained by theft, his insistence meant that his students had little choice but to become grave robbers in practice if not in name. It was a moral blind spot. one shared by much of the profession. The doctors believed themselves to be serving the greater good, and in that conviction, they justified almost anything. Yet not all physicians were comfortable. Some expressed unease, fearing that their profession was being dragged through the mud by its reliance on stolen corpses. They worried about public backlash, about the loss of trust. But those voices were drowned out by the louder conviction that without bodies, their science would stagnate. The Enlightenment had promised progress through reason and study. How could America claim to be a nation of progress if its doctors remained ignorant of the very anatomy of their patients? To fall behind Europe was, in their minds, unthinkable. This hunger for knowledge blinded them to the cost. They failed to see that every body they dissected carried with it a story, a family, a community. They ignored the fact that the graves they plundered were almost always those of the poor, the enslaved, the marginalized. In their pursuit of equality with European medicine, they perpetuated inequality at home. The irony was bitter. They sought to elevate themselves by cutting down those already voiceless in life. The arrogance of the medical profession also revealed itself in their attitude towards secrecy. They worked behind closed doors, convinced that the public could not understand their methods. And in a sense, they were right. The sight of a dissected corpse was shocking, horrifying, almost unbearable to those unaccustomed to it. But secrecy bred suspicion, and suspicion bred hatred. Every locked door, every whisper of bodies smuggled into the hospital under cover of night, deepened the divide between doctor and citizen. Instead of building trust, they cultivated fear. When the riot came, many of these men were shocked by its intensity. They had expected disapproval, perhaps even protests, but not an eruption of violence. They underestimated the depth of the public's rage, the sacred bond families felt with their dead. To the doctors, a body was a vessel of knowledge. To the people, it was the very soul of their loved one. The inability, or unwillingness, of the doctors to see this difference proved fatal. As the mob hunted them through the hospital halls, dragging students into the streets, the doctors must have felt the full weight of their isolation. They had stood apart from society, convinced of their higher calling, but now they were paying the price. In the eyes of the people, they were no longer healers but violators, not saviors but predators. Their scalpels had become weapons, their studies crimes. Yet even in the aftermath, many physicians refused to repent. Some doubled down, insisting that the riot was proof of public ignorance, that progress had been delayed by superstition and fear. Others quietly adjusted, moving their studies deeper underground, ensuring that dissections were hidden more carefully in the future. Very few paused to ask the deeper question: had their hunger for knowledge blinded them to the humanity of those whose bodies they used? The doctors' riot revealed the stark contrast between the way the medical profession saw itself and the way the public saw it. To the doctors, they were pioneers, martyrs even, persecuted for their dedication to science. To the people, they were grave robbers cloaked in authority, men who treated their dead with contempt. Both perspectives carried truth, but it was the clash between them that turned suspicion into bloodshed. And in that clash lay a lesson that still lingers, that progress pursued without empathy is not progress at all. The doctors of 1788 believed they were advancing medicine, but in doing so, they severed the fragile trust between themselves and the society they served. The scalpel may have revealed the secrets of the body, but it also cut a wound into the heart of New York, one that would take generations to heal. When the chaos finally began to subside, New York was a city transformed. The riot that had erupted over stolen corpses left not only bodies in the streets but wounds in the very fabric of trust between citizens and their physicians. The militia, exhausted and blooded, patrolled the avenues like soldiers after battle. The smell of smoke and powder still hung in the air. Broken glass littered the cobblestones, doors and windows gaped like shattered teeth, and whispers moved through the city like a second storm. The riot had ended, but the anger had not. In the days that followed, the full toll became clear. Dozens were wounded, and though accounts vary, many were killed in the clashes between militia and rioters. Families mourned again, this time not for stolen graves but for loved ones felled by musket fire. The irony was bitter. An uprising sparked by the desecration of the dead had created even more bodies to bury. Yet for many, the blood spilled in the streets only deepened their conviction that their cause had been just. The doctors, however, faced an entirely different reality. The New York hospital was in ruins, both physically and reputationally. Its dissecting rooms had been torn apart, its instruments scattered or destroyed. For weeks, it stood as a symbol of public hatred, the walls themselves tainted with the memory of what had been found inside. Students abandoned their posts, some fleeing the city altogether, others retreating into hiding. The profession that had hoped to command respect was now viewed with suspicion, even disgust. To call someone a doctor was, for a time, to invite scorn. Authorities scrambled to restore order, but they did so delicately, careful not to ignite another wave of violence. Some rioters were arrested, but most were quietly released, the government recognizing that punishing the crowd would only stoke the embers of rage. The doctors, too, faced little in the way of formal punishment, though they hardly needed it. The wrath of the public was punishment enough. In the court of opinion, they had already been condemned. Politicians seized on the moment, some calling for stricter oversight of medical schools, others denouncing the practice of grave robbing outright. Sermons thundered from pulpits, condemning the arrogance of science that dared to violate the sanctity of the grave. Newspapers published lurid accounts of what had been found in the hospital, reminding readers of the grotesque scenes that had sparked the riot. The press, already inclined toward sensationalism, painted doctors as villains, cold men who cut into flesh without regard for decency or humanity. For the city's ordinary people, the riot became a grim kind of victory. They had forced the authorities to recognize their anger, forced the doctors to retreat, forced the hospital to bear the weight of their wrath. But it was a victory tinged with grief, for they also buried those killed in the clashes, adding fresh layers of sorrow to the already heavy soil of New York. For many, the riot was not just about graves, it was about dignity, about power, about the refusal to remain silent in the face of exploitation. The medical community, shaken but unrepentant, responded by moving its practices further underground. Dissections did not stop, they simply became more secretive. Students and instructors took greater precautions, hiding cadavers in cellars, conducting lessons behind locked doors, and smuggling bodies with even more care. If anything, the riot taught them not to abandon anatomy but to conceal it more effectively. The hunger for knowledge had not been extinguished, it had merely been forced into the shadows. This secrecy, however, came at a cost. The already fragile relationship between doctors and the public grew colder still. Patients eyed physicians with suspicion, wondering what hidden practices they pursued behind closed doors. Families hesitated to trust hospitals, fearing what might happen if their loved ones died within those walls. The very people doctors sought to heal now feared them, and the wound of mistrust would linger for years. For the city's black community, the aftermath carried particular weight. They had borne the brunt of the desecration, their graves plundered more than any other group. In the wake of the riot, they demanded recognition of their dead, protection for their burial grounds, and respect for their humanity. While change was slow, the uprising had made one thing undeniable: their voices could not be silenced, not in life and not in death. The African burial ground became not only a site of mourning but a symbol of resistance. The riot also rippled beyond New York. News traveled quickly to other cities: Philadelphia, Boston, even across the Atlantic. Everywhere, it raised the same uncomfortable question: how could medicine advance without bodies, and how could societies allow grave robbing to continue without erupting into chaos? The doctors' riot was not just a local tragedy, it was a warning, a signal that the old balance could not hold. Change would be required, though it would take decades before laws were written to provide legal cadavers for dissection. In the immediate aftermath, however, the city tried simply to move on. Shops reopened, funerals were held for those killed, and the militia returned to their barracks. But the memory lingered, heavy as the summer heat. Families walked past the hospital with narrowed eyes. Children whispered about the horrors they had seen or imagined within its walls. The riot had entered the folklore of the city, a story retold in taverns and kitchens, a warning about what happens when the powerful exploit the powerless. For the doctors, the lesson was more complicated. Some saw themselves as martyrs to ignorance, victims of superstition who had been punished for pursuing truth. Others, more cautious, recognized that they had crossed a line, that science could not exist in defiance of society's deepest values. But even for them, the question lingered: was it possible to reconcile the need for knowledge with the demand for respect? Or was medicine destined always to carry a stain, a reminder of the corpses stolen in the name of progress? The aftermath of the doctors' riot was not tidy. It did not resolve the tension between medicine and morality, nor did it restore trust between doctors and citizens. Instead, it left a scar, raw and visible, reminding New York that the price of progress is never borne equally. Some pay with their dignity, some with their grief, and some with their blood in the streets. And as the city buried its dead once more, both those stolen and those slain in the riot, one truth was undeniable: The boundary between the living and the dead had been crossed, and it could not be uncrossed. The question now was not whether it would happen again, but what kind of society would emerge from the shadow of such a wound. The riot in New York was shocking, but it was not unique. The city's fury over stolen corpses was only one chapter in a much larger story, a story that stretched across America and Europe, where medicine's hunger for bodies clashed again and again with the public's reverence for the grave. In this sense, New York's upheaval was not an aberration, but a warning signal, part of a broader wave of unrest that haunted the 18th and 19th centuries. In Boston, just a few years earlier, suspicions of grave robbing had already erupted into violence. In 1788, the very same year as New York's riot, a crowd in Boston stormed a medical school after rumors that doctors had been digging up corpses from local cemeteries. The pattern was eerily familiar. Poor and marginalized communities found their dead targeted, whispers spread, and soon an angry mob descended on the physicians responsible. Philadelphia, too, would face similar upheaval, with its medical schools accused of robbing burial grounds to feed the insatiable demand for cadavers. In each case, the spark was the same, the sense that the dignity of the powerless was being sacrificed for the ambitions of the elite. The anger was not confined to America. Across the Atlantic, Britain was enduring its own crisis over bodies. In London and Edinburgh, the trade in corpses had become a grim profession. Resurrection men, as they were called, made their living by stealing bodies from graveyards and selling them to anatomy schools. They worked in gangs, armed with shovels and carts, bribing graveyard keepers or overpowering mourners. Families fought back by installing iron cages, known as mortsafes, over fresh graves, or by hiring guards to watch burial grounds through the night. The conflict between doctors and citizens had become a shadow war, fought in the soil of cemeteries, in the dead of night, under the flickering light of lanterns. Edinburgh, in particular, became notorious for its body-snatching trade. By the early 19th century, the demand for cadavers was so intense that it gave rise to one of the most infamous cases in medical history, Burke and Hare, who murdered at least 16 people in order to sell their bodies for dissection. Their crime shocked Britain, revealing how the hunger for anatomical study could turn grave robbing into outright murder. Though this came decades after New York's riot, it was part of the same trajectory, the same desperate quest for bodies that had plagued medicine since the Enlightenment. What united these events was the same uneasy truth. Science demanded what society refused to give. Anatomy could not progress without cadavers, but the law offered few legal means to obtain them. Executed criminals' bodies were sometimes provided, but executions were far too rare to supply the growing number of medical schools. And so, physicians turned to theft, whether through their own students or through professional body snatchers. In the process, they placed themselves in direct conflict with the very people they were meant to serve. The echoes between New York and these other cities are striking. In every case, it was the poor and marginalized who suffered most. In London, it was the working-class districts whose graves were plundered. In Edinburgh, it was the destitute whose bodies were sold for study. In New York, it was the enslaved, the free black families, the immigrants, and the poor who found their dead stolen. The injustice was universal. Those with wealth could protect their loved ones in death, while those without were left defenseless. The riots and scandals also forced governments to confront a reality they had long ignored. After New York's riot, officials recognized the volatility of leaving the issue unresolved. Across Europe, the public outrage over body snatching grew so intense that lawmakers were eventually forced to act. The culmination came with Britain's Anatomy Act of 1832, which legalized the use of unclaimed bodies, often those of the poor who died in workhouses or hospitals, for medical study. It was a grim solution, one that solved the problem of supply but did so by institutionalizing the exploitation of the powerless. In America, similar patterns emerged. States began to pass laws granting medical schools access to unclaimed bodies from prisons, almshouses, and hospitals. The riots may have ended, but the injustice did not. Instead of secret theft, the supply of bodies became legalized theft, sanctioned by the state. The poor still paid the price, only now their sacrifice was written into law. Looking back, the doctors' riot of 1788 feels less like an isolated explosion and more like the opening salvo of a century-long struggle. It was the moment when New York citizens declared that they would not accept the theft of their dead in silence. It was also the moment when medicine realized that its hunger for knowledge would not go unchallenged. The riot reverberated far beyond its immediate violence, shaping the debates and laws that would follow across continents. But in every city, in every country, the question remained the same. How do you reconcile the demands of science with the sanctity of the grave? How do you balance the hunger for progress with the dignity of the powerless? The riots in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, London, and Edinburgh did not provide an answer. They only forced society to admit that the question could no longer be ignored. In the end, the doctors' riot was not simply a New York story. It was part of a global pattern, a chapter in humanity's uneasy relationship with death and discovery. And though laws would eventually be written to manage the conflict, the legacy of those riots remains, a reminder that the path to progress has always been paved with the bodies of those who had the least power to resist. The doctors' riot in New York was not forgotten. Its violence left scars on the city, but it also left a lesson that echoed far beyond its time. If governments and physicians continued to ignore the sanctity of the grave, society would not remain silent. The riot was one of many that forced lawmakers, in both America and Europe, to finally confront the problem they had long tried to bury. In the end, what began as whispered rumors and furious mobs would shape the very laws of medicine. In the decades that followed, the same pattern repeated itself in city after city. In Philadelphia, mobs rose against medical students suspected of grave robbing. In Boston, families patrolled cemeteries, arming themselves against the midnight shovel. In London, resurrection men grew bolder, raiding churchyards and carting bodies away beneath the noses of grieving families. And in Edinburgh, the case of Burke and Hare, men who murdered the living to sell their corpses, shocked Britain into a new kind of fear. The message was clear: unless the state stepped in, the hunger for cadavers would continue to fuel unrest, scandal, and even bloodshed. By the early 19th century, lawmakers could no longer deny the truth. The demand for bodies was growing, not shrinking. Medical schools were expanding, doctors were multiplying, and every student needed corpses to practice on. But the supply of executed criminals, the only legal source, was woefully inadequate. In some years, there were no executions at all, leaving entire classes of students without cadavers. Without reform, medicine would remain trapped in secrecy, fueled by theft and violence. And without reform, the public's fury would erupt again and again. The solution came in the form of legislation, the most famous of which was Britain's Anatomy Act of 1832. This law, born directly from decades of riots and scandals, changed the course of medical study. It legalized the dissection of unclaimed bodies, those who died in prisons, hospitals, and workhouses, whose families either could not or would not claim them. On the surface, it seemed a practical answer. The supply of bodies increased, students gained the material they needed, and the shadowy trade of grave robbing began to decline. But beneath this apparent progress lay a darker truth. The law had merely shifted the burden from stolen graves to institutionalized exploitation. Those most often dissected under the Anatomy Act were still the poor, the voiceless, the marginalized. A wealthy family could still bury its dead in guarded cemeteries, protected by stone and iron. But the pauper who died in a workhouse, alone and unclaimed, could be wheeled straight from the deathbed to the dissection table. In practice, the act legalized what the mobs had already known, that the powerless would always pay the highest price for progress. America followed a similar path, though each state crafted its own laws. By the mid-19th century, many states had passed legislation granting medical schools access to unclaimed bodies from almshouses, hospitals, and prisons. These laws, like Britain's, were designed to end grave robbing by making cadavers available through official channels. Yet again, it was the poor and the imprisoned who supplied the anatomy rooms. In New York, the very city where the 1788 riot had erupted, medical schools eventually dissected countless bodies of those who died penniless in state institutions. To the physicians, these laws represented progress. No longer did they need to sneak into cemeteries under cover of night. No longer did they fear mobs tearing down their doors. Dissection became a legitimate part of medical education, openly practiced, even celebrated as a mark of scientific advancement. But the stigma remained, etched into public memory. Families still feared the fate of dying in poverty, knowing it could mean their body would be handed to students without ceremony or consent. For many, the thought of the dissection table was more terrifying than the grave itself. The legacy of these laws reveals the uneasy compromise between science and society. Progress demanded bodies, and society provided them, but always from those least able to resist. The doctors' riot had made it clear that the people would not tolerate random theft from their graves. The state responded by creating a system that gave the appearance of order, but at its core, the injustice remained. The poor, in both life and death, continued to serve as the foundation on which medicine built its knowledge. And yet, there is no denying that these laws changed the course of medicine. With a steady supply of cadavers, students learned anatomy with a precision never before possible. Surgeons honed their skills. Physicians mapped the human body in detail. Lives were saved in the decades that followed, saved by knowledge that had been purchased with the bodies of the forgotten. The cost was heavy, but the results were undeniable. Looking back, it is tempting to see the Anatomy Act and its American counterparts as milestones of progress. And in a sense, they were. But they were also reminders of a deeper truth, that sciences always walk hand in hand with exploitation, that progress is rarely clean, and that the voices of the powerless are too often drowned out by the ambitions of the powerful. The Doctors' Riot of 1788 was one of the sparks that ignited this transformation. Without the fury of that crowd, without the blood spilled on New York streets, lawmakers might have ignored the problem even longer. The riot forced society to acknowledge a tension it had tried to bury, the living's need for healing against the dead's right to rest. In the end, the solution was not to protect both, but to sacrifice one for the other. And so the story turns, from stolen graves in the dead of night to legalized dissection under the banner of law. From mobs breaking down hospital doors to students dissecting openly in lecture halls. From scandal and secrecy to institutionalized exploitation. It is a legacy that cannot be disentangled from modern medicine, a reminder that the bodies on which knowledge was built were not given, but taken, first by thieves in the dark, and later by the state itself. The streets of New York eventually grew quiet again. The broken doors of the hospital were repaired, the militia returned to their barracks, and the dead from both the riot and the dissecting rooms were laid to rest once more. On the surface, life moved forward, as it always does. But the memory of 1788 did not fade. It lingered like a scar, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is never free, that every step forward in science leaves footprints in the soil of human suffering. The Doctors' Riot is often remembered as a clash between ignorance and progress, between a fearful public and forward-looking physicians. But to frame it so simply is to miss the deeper truth. The riot was not born from superstition alone. It was born from grief, from inequality, from centuries of indignity heaped upon the powerless. It was not simply that doctors dissected bodies. It was that the bodies they chose came from those who could not defend themselves, those who in life had been marginalized and in death were treated as raw material. This is what gives the story its enduring power. Modern medicine, the surgeries and treatments that save millions today, are built on knowledge that came from those dissections. Every map of the human body, every chart of veins and muscles, every insight that guides a surgeon's hand owes something to the corpses cut open in places like New York Hospital. The irony is almost unbearable. The poor who suffered most from disease and neglect in life gave, through their unwilling sacrifice, the knowledge that would one day save others. Their dignity was denied, but their contribution became eternal, though unacknowledged. The riot also raises questions that remain disturbingly relevant. How far should science go in pursuit of progress? Who bears the cost when knowledge is gained at the expense of consent? We like to believe that such questions belong to the past, that we have outgrown the crude practices of body snatching. But the echoes are still with us. From unethical medical experiments on vulnerable populations to debates over genetic engineering and organ donation, the same question persists. What is the price of progress, and who is forced to pay it? In this way, the ghosts of 1788 are not buried. They linger in every ethical debate, every controversy over medicine and science. They whisper that progress without empathy is not progress but exploitation. They remind us that behind every discovery lies a story of those who had no voice. The riot also revealed something profound about the power of ordinary people. In a society where the poor had little political influence, little say in the shaping of laws, they still found a way to make themselves heard. They rose together, fueled by grief and fury, and they forced the city to confront their anger. It came at a terrible cost, lives lost, blood in the streets, but it was a statement no government, no physician, could ignore. The people demanded dignity for their dead, and in doing so, they carved their voices into the history of medicine. But the resolution of their fury was imperfect. The laws that followed, the Anatomy Acts and their American counterparts, solved the problem for doctors but not for the poor. Instead of protecting the vulnerable, they codified their exploitation, turning the unclaimed dead into a state-sanctioned supply. The riot may have ended grave robbing, but it did not end injustice. It only changed its form. Progress marched forward, but the same groups, paupers, prisoners, the marginalized, were still sacrificed to fuel it. To tell the story of the Doctors' Riot, then, is not only to tell a story of the past. It is to hold a mirror to the present, to ask whether we have truly learned the lesson it offered. Have we built a system of medicine that values every life equally, that honors dignity as much as discovery? Or do we still, in ways less visible but just as real, ask the powerless to bear the weight of our ambition? The images of that April day in 1788 remain chilling. The boy running from the hospital, screaming that his mother's body had been stolen. The mob hurling dissected limbs into the street. The militia firing into crowds, bodies collapsing onto the cobblestones. These are not just details of a forgotten riot, they are warnings. They tell us what happens when trust collapses, when institutions place their goals above the humanity of those they serve. They tell us that science without consent is not enlightenment but violence. As night fell over New York after the riot, families returned to their graves to stand watch, to protect the bodies of their loved ones. Some sat with lanterns through the darkness, weapons at their sides, daring anyone to disturb the soil. It was a vigil born of fear but also of love, an act of defiance against a world that had tried to strip them of even the simplest dignity. In those quiet vigils, we find the true heart of the story, not in the rage of the mob or the arrogance of the doctors, but in the silent determination of families who refused to let their dead be stolen again. The doctors' riot of 1788 was not just about bodies. It was about the eternal struggle between progress and morality, between knowledge and dignity. It was about whose lives, and whose deaths, are valued, and whose are dismissed as expendable. And though more than 2 centuries have passed, the questions it raised have not been answered. The graves of those who were stolen, the blood of those who were slain, the silence of those who were forgotten, they are all part of the foundation on which modern medicine stands. To acknowledge that is not to condemn progress, but to remember its cost. And to remember is, perhaps, the first step toward ensuring that the mistakes of the past do not become the shadows of the future.